Hello, and welcome to Embedded Linux. I'm your instructor, Doug Abbott. Our objective in this course is to introduce tools and techniques to help you apply Linux in embedded environments. Linux is one of, if not the most popular embedded operating system these days. So let's start by briefly describing what the course is about. Fundamentally, it's about applying Linux in embedded environments. We'll start with a brief introduction to Linux and the basic open source philosophy. We'll look at installing a cross-development environment, which allows us to develop programs on a workstation and then move them over and run them on the target computer. We'll look at the open source Eclipse IDE, and we'll run and debug applications on an embedded target computer and configure and build the Linux kernel. We'll look at booting the target and network applications. And there are a number of demonstrations and exercises in this class, and of course you can't learn programming without doing it. So I strongly urge you to do all of the exercises. So our objectives are to be able to set up and use a cross-development environment on a Linux workstation, create, build, and debug applications, specifically using the Eclipse IDE, write multi-threaded and networked applications, configure and build the Linux kernel, and install and boot applications in a product form. Course prerequisites are not too stringent. Of course, you must be reasonably proficient in C programming. We'll be writing a number of relatively simple applications over the course of the class. And it's certainly helpful if you've had at least some Linux experience. But as I mentioned, we'll take some time in the first lesson to go over the basics. And just for the record, Linux is a registered trademark of Linus Torvalds, who started this whole crazy Linux business back in 1991. So let's go through a detailed list of topics for the class. The first lesson is an introduction to Linux, and we'll also review the process of installing Linux if you don't already have it running on your workstation. Then we'll take a couple of lessons to go through the KDE graphical desktop environment and the Linux command shell. We'll take another 2 lessons to look at the Eclipse development environment. Then we'll configure both the workstation and the target single board computer. Then it's time to build and run some target applications and debug those applications. We'll introduce a simple simulation environment that lets you do some of your initial debugging on the workstation. We'll introduce multi-threading using POSIX threads. Then comes networking, and we'll play around with a simple network web server. We'll do some simple graphics programming on the target board's LCD panel. We'll look at configuring and building the Linux kernel. There are 2 very useful tools in the embedded Linux world, BusyBox and the U-Boot bootloader. We'll take a look at both of those. And finally, we'll look at putting the application onto the target board and booting it up directly. In other words, essentially getting it ready to ship. And finally, our last lesson will be a wrap-up and summary. Be sure to visit the Course Materials tab on the website to download the sample code and the exercise guide. Okay, let's get started.